5,000 meters below the surface, the ocean is not just water. It is a crushing, suffocating weight that tries to turn your world into a singularity. I am inside the Icarus IV, a deep-sea research vessel built with titanium plates thick enough to withstand the pressure of a collapsing star, or at least that is what the engineers told us. Down here, the silence isn't empty. It has a texture. It feels like heavy velvet pressing against your eardrums, punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the oxygen scrubbers and the occasional groaning of the hull as the current shifts against us. My mission was simple. We were monitoring tectonic shifts in the Hadal Zone, documenting things that humans were never meant to witness. My crewmate, Elias, was asleep in the bunk below. The cabin was bathed in the dim, sickly amber light of the emergency console. I was staring at the sonar monitor, watching the ghostly pings of nothingness, when the first sound came. It wasn't the groaning of metal. It wasn't the whine of the external cameras shifting in the current. It was a sharp, distinct, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. It vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of my boots and settling into the marrow of my bones. I froze. You have to understand that outside this hull, the pressure is over 7,000 pounds per square inch. Nothing alive exists out there. Certainly nothing with knuckles. I leaned toward the wall, pressing my ear against the freezing cold titanium. Tap, 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 tap. It was a pattern, a rhythm. It sounded exactly like someone standing on the exterior catwalk, frantically signaling for help. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Elias stirred in his bunk, his breathing ragged. I called out to him, my voice sounding thin and alien in the cramped space, but he only rolled over, clutching his blanket. I looked at the external temperature gauge. 3 degrees Celsius. Impossible. The sensor should have been crushed or frozen, yet it read a steady, mocking temperature. I walked to the viewport, though I knew the external lights wouldn't reach more than a few feet into the absolute, soul-eating blackness. I flicked the toggle for the external floodlights. The ocean surged into view, a swirling vortex of silt and dark, planktonic snow. There was nothing there, just the empty, endless abyss. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, feeling like a fool, until the sound came again, louder this time, right next to the glass. Scraping, like fingernails dragging across the reinforced acrylic, carving lines into the surface that shouldn't be possible. I stumbled back, knocking over a canister of water. The sound amplified, turning into a frantic, wet thumping against the hull. It sounded like a body being thrown against the metal over and over, desperate and rhythmic. I scrambled to the intercom, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely hit the buttons. Elias, wake up, I screamed. Wake up right now. He sat up, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the wall behind me. He didn't look at me. He looked at the hull, his head tilting to the side in a sickening, jerky motion. Do you hear that? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the scrubbers. It is asking to be let in. I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him, telling him we needed to prep the ascent. But he shoved me away with a strength that didn't belong to a man who had been eating rations for 3 months. He walked to the center of the cabin and began to trace shapes on the floor, using the condensation that had gathered on the cold deck plating. They are hungry, he murmured. They have been waiting for someone to descend to their level. I turned back to the hull, terrified that the glass would shatter, that the black water would rush in and turn us into jelly. But the knocking stopped. For a long, agonizing minute, the ship was silent again. Then the communications array began to whine. A high-pitched, screeching feedback loop filled the room, and from the speakers, a voice emerged. Wasn't human. It was a composite, a digital mimicry of 1,000 distorted recordings of my own voice, overlapping and shivering. "Help me," the voice whispered in my own tone. "I am outside. I am cold." I looked at the monitor. The sonar had changed. It was no longer pinging the seafloor. It was pinging a massive, shifting shape that was wrapping itself around the entire vessel. It looked like a forest of limbs, thick as oak trees, pulsating with a bioluminescence that wasn't blue or green, but a color I didn't have a name for. It was the color of a nightmare. Elias was now standing by the airlock, his hand hovering over the manual release lever. He looked at me, and his eyes were completely black, the pupils dilated until the iris had vanished. "Don't you want to join them?" he asked, his voice shifting into that same distorted, digital drone. "Don't you want to see what is underneath the floor of the world?" I grabbed a wrench from the bulkhead, desperation giving me a jagged, animal strength. I lunged for him, but the sub lurched violently, throwing us both against the cabinets. A warning light flashed red across the console. Structural breach detected. Not in the hull, but in the airlock seal. The inner door began to hiss, freezing air venting into the cabin, coating everything in a layer of jagged ice. The knocking returned, but this time it was coming from inside the airlock. Someone was standing in the transition chamber between the inner and outer doors. The knocking grew frantic, then transformed into a wet, slapping sound, as if something liquid and heavy was being pressed against the hatch. Couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin was thinning, turning metallic and sour. I backed away, pressing myself against the far corner, watching as the seam of the airlock door began to buckle. A dark, viscous fluid started to seep through the gap, bubbling as it hit the pressurized air. It smelled like ancient decay, like a tomb that had been flooded with stagnant, salt-heavy bile. Elias began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the Icarus. He reached for the handle, his fingers digging into the metal. I didn't stop him. Couldn't. I was paralyzed by the realization that the thing outside wasn't trying to break in. It was already part of the ship. We hadn't been exploring the trench. We had been invited into a belly. The ship gave a final, violent jolt, and the lights died completely, leaving us in a darkness so absolute it felt like being blinded. In the pitch black, the knocking resumed, but it was no longer coming from the outside. It was coming from the vents, from the ceiling, from behind my own ears. A soft, wet tapping on my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could hear the sound of the inner airlock opening, the screech of rusted metal giving way, and the heavy, slow movement of something massive dragging itself across the floor. Elias whispered one last thing before the screaming started, his voice right against my neck, cold as the abyss. "Welcome home," he said. "Welcome to the bottom of the long, dark sleep. I am still here, writing this in the black, while the tapping continues, always in rhythm, always getting louder, waiting for me to finally stop holding my breath and let the ocean take its due."